Relief always arrives before understanding does. There's a specific kind of calm that settles over someone right after they end a relationship. It's not celebration. It's not triumph. It's something quieter. A loosening in the chest. A sense that a weight they'd been carrying for months has finally been set down. From the outside, it might look like coldness or indifference, but inside, it registers as proof. Proof that leaving was right. Proof that the relationship was the problem. The body responds before the mind can articulate why, and that response, relief, becomes its own kind of evidence. This is where behavior analysis becomes essential, because what looks like resolution is often something else entirely. Relationship psychology reveals a pattern that plays out with remarkable consistency. The person who ends things almost always feels better first. Not because they're cruel, but because they've been emotionally withdrawing for longer than anyone realized. By the time the words are spoken, they've already traveled half the distance. The shock, the grief, the disorientation that the other person feels immediately. The dumper already absorbed those in smaller private doses over weeks or months. So when the break finally happens, they're not starting from zero. They're finishing a process that began long before. And that head start creates a psychological dynamic that's easy to misread, both by them and by everyone watching. What makes this particularly complex is that the relief is real. The decrease in tension, the absence of daily conflict, the freedom from having to manage another person's emotional needs, all of it produces measurable changes in the nervous system. The dumper sleeps better, breathes easier, moves through their days without the low-level dread that had become so familiar they stopped noticing it. Emotional behavior in this phase looks stable, even healthy. And because it feels so much better than what came before, the mind builds a story around it. The relationship was wrong, leaving was necessary, and this relief is evidence of both. But attachment patterns don't work that cleanly. What feels like clarity is often just the temporary peace that comes from ending internal conflict, not proof that the conflict was unresolvable. There's a window of time where everything seems to confirm the decision. The dumper isn't drowning in regret. They're not paralyzed by doubt. They're functioning, maybe even thriving in ways they couldn't while the relationship was limping toward its end. Emotional distance, which created so much pain within the relationship, now feels like wisdom. Like self-protection, like evidence of growth. And maybe it is those things, but it might also be avoidance wearing a more sophisticated face. The distinction matters, because one leads somewhere sustainable, and the other just delays the reckoning. The question isn't whether the relief is real. The question is what happens when relief stops being enough. When the initial calm fades, and the structure underneath starts to show its cracks. That's when the real story begins. There's a moment that arrives without announcement. No declaration, no ceremony. Just a shift in the body, something loosening in the chest, a kind of quiet that wasn't there before. The dumper doesn't always recognize it immediately. It feels like exhaling after holding breath for months. The relationship psychology at play here isn't about cruelty or indifference. It's about the end of carrying weight that became unbearable in silence. The tension that built through unspoken resentments, through emotional labor no one witnessed, suddenly begins to dissolve. And in that dissolution, relief enters. Not loud, not celebrated. Just present. This relief doesn't come from hurting someone. It comes from the cessation of internal conflict. For weeks, maybe months, There was a war happening inside, between what they felt and what they believed they should feel, between staying and the growing inability to stay authentically. That dissonance creates a specific kind of exhaustion. When the decision is finally made, even before it's spoken, the body responds first. The nervous system registers the end of that split. What they feel in those early hours or days is the absence of that fracture. It's not joy. It's the relief of no longer being two people at once. But here's what makes this particularly complex within attachment patterns. The relief is real, and it's also incomplete. It exists in a pocket of time where consequences haven't arrived yet. The emotional withdrawal that led to this point created a buffer, a kind of insulation. They've been emotionally leaving for longer than the calendar would suggest. So when the physical or verbal break happens, they've already traveled some of that distance. The shock others feel, they've already absorbed it in smaller private doses. The relief comes from finally aligning external reality with internal truth, from no longer pretending. Yet even in that early calm, something else is present. It's barely noticeable, easy to dismiss as residual anxiety or guilt. But it's there, a faint awareness that this relief might be temporary, that it might be the eye of something larger. They don't focus on it yet. The immediate sensation is too consuming, too necessary. The body needed this break from tension. But beneath that biological calm, patterns are already forming. Psychological dynamics don't pause just because a decision was made. They continue, quietly, in the background. And what feels like resolution now is often just the beginning of a different kind of reckoning. The lightness arrives before the story does, before they can articulate why it was necessary, before they've constructed the narrative that will make sense to others or to themselves. There's simply this. Breathing feels easier. Mornings don't carry the same dread. The emotional behavior shifts in small, almost imperceptible ways. Less bracing for conflict, less monitoring of tone, less calculating what can or cannot be said. This isn't about happiness. It's about the absence of a specific kind of heaviness. The weight of maintaining something that stopped working, of performing connection that no longer existed organically. When that performance ends, the body registers freedom before the mind catches up. This phase is deceptive because it feels like evidence. The dumper experiences this lightness and interprets it, unconsciously, as confirmation. If leaving feels this much better, the thinking goes, then staying must have been wrong. But what they're actually feeling is relief from tension, not proof of incompatibility. Relationship dynamics often break down long before the relationship ends. The heaviness they're escaping wasn't always inherent to the partnership. It was the result of unaddressed patterns, of emotional distance that calcified into permanent space. The relief they feel now is from ending the dissonance, not necessarily from ending the right thing or the wrong thing. It's just the end of internal war. There's a particular quality to this early lightness. It exists without defense, without the need to explain itself. They're not yet justifying the decision to friends, not yet facing questions or doubt from the outside world. In this brief window, the relief is private and pure. They move through their days with a strange ease, noticing how much energy they were spending just managing proximity to another person. How much of their nervous system was engaged in tracking, adjusting, avoiding. Emotional triggers that used to activate them daily, suddenly quiet. Not because they've healed, but because the source of activation has been removed. It's the psychological equivalent of leaving a loud room and only realizing how loud it was once you're outside. But here's the edge of it. This lightness is untested. It exists in a kind of vacuum, where the dumper is surrounded by their own narrative, their own sensations, their own version of events. They haven't yet encountered the reality of what was lost, only the relief of what was released. The behavior analysis would show that they're not yet engaging with absence, only with the end of presence. There's a difference, and that difference matters. Because lightness that comes from subtraction isn't the same as peace that comes from resolution. One is temporary, the other is structural. And right now, they can't tell which one they're holding. Silence, in the early days, feels like sanctuary. The absence of conversation doesn't register as loss. It registers as relief. No more navigating tone, no more parsing subtext, no more tension hiding beneath everyday exchange. The dumper begins to reinterpret what silence means. Where it once signaled disconnection or distance, it now represents freedom. They sit alone in their space and feel something they haven't felt in months. Calm. Not the calm that comes from resolution, but the calm that comes from the end of effort. And for a while, that distinction doesn't matter. The nervous system responds the same way. It rests. This reinterpretation is one of the most revealing aspects of emotional withdrawal. The silence they're experiencing now isn't fundamentally different from the silence that existed before the breakup. Emotional distance was already present. Communication breakdown had already occurred, but context changes everything. When silence happened inside the relationship, it felt like failure. Evidence of something wrong, something dying. Now, outside the relationship, that same silence is reframed as peace, as space to breathe. The content hasn't changed, only the story around it. And the mind, seeking coherence, accepts the new story without questioning whether the silence itself was ever the problem. There's a subtle comfort in this phase. The dumper doesn't have to perform anymore. Doesn't have to manage another person's emotions. Doesn't have to explain themselves. Doesn't have to carry the low-grade anxiety of knowing they're not showing up the way they should. Attachment patterns reveal themselves most clearly in what we feel relief from. If the absence of another person brings this much ease, it suggests the presence had become synonymous with burden. But the question that hasn't arrived yet is whether that burden was inherent to the person, or whether it was the cumulative weight of unmet emotional needs and unspoken resentment. Right now, the dumper isn't asking that question. They're just experiencing the quiet. But there's something else woven into this silence. It's easy to miss because it doesn't announce itself. Beneath the peace, there's a growing emptiness that hasn't been named yet. The relationship patterns that once filled time and space, checking in, shared routines, ambient presence, are gone. That absence creates a specific kind of void. It's not painful yet. It's just there. The dumper notices it in passing. Moments where they almost reach for their phone, almost share something, almost turn to speak before remembering no one is there. These micro moments don't disrupt the peace, but they're collecting quietly, building a case the mind isn't ready to hear. The calm deepens. Days pass, maybe weeks, and the dumper settles into a rhythm that feels increasingly right. There's space now, literal and emotional, and that space feels like health. They're no longer managing someone else's moods, no longer adjusting themselves to maintain equilibrium in a system that required constant calibration. The psychological dynamics here are specific. They're experiencing calm, not because they've found peace, but because they've removed complexity. And for a nervous system that was chronically activated, that removal feels like healing. It feels like progress. But it's not connection. It's the absence of demand. This kind of calm is seductive because it's real. The body isn't lying. The reduction in cortisol, the easier sleep, the absence of that low-level dread, all of it is physiologically verifiable. What makes it complicated is that this calm is being generated by distance, not by resolution. Emotional behavior in this phase shows a pattern. The dumper begins to associate peace with solitude and solitude with safety. They start to build a life that revolves around not being accountable to another person's emotional world. And that can feel for a time like freedom. Like finally being able to breathe without someone else's hand on their chest. But there's an inversion happening beneath awareness. The calm they're feeling is dependent on absence. It requires that no one get too close, that no emotional intimacy challenge the equilibrium. This isn't sustainable architecture, it's a temporary shelter. Relationship psychology reveals a consistent pattern. When people equate peace with distance, they're often avoiding the discomfort of intimacy itself, not the specific person they left. The partner becomes a proxy for the vulnerability that closeness requires. And in the early post-breakup phase, when relief is high and consequences are still distant, it's easy to believe the problem was them, not the deeper resistance to being truly known. The dumper starts to notice things, small things. They're calmer, yes, but they're also contained. Nothing reaches them the way it used to. Not just the difficult emotions, but the expansive ones too. Joy, when it comes, is muted. Excitement doesn't spike. Even anger, when something genuinely frustrating happens, feels manageable, almost too manageable. They're operating in a narrower emotional bandwidth. Emotional detachment, when it becomes a baseline state, doesn't discriminate. It mutes everything. And while that can feel like maturity or emotional regulation, it's often just shut down wearing a sophisticated mask. The calm they're living in isn't the calm of resolution. It's the calm of removal. And removal, over time, starts to feel less like peace and more like absence. The mind begins its work. Because the body has registered relief, the brain needs a story that makes sense of it. This is where internal narratives start to form. Not always consciously, not always deliberately, but inevitably. The dumper begins to construct explanations for why they feel better. The relationship was draining. The other person was too needy, too distant, too something. They weren't compatible. Timing was wrong. The evidence is right there. Since leaving, everything feels lighter. The narrative builds itself around that felt sense of ease. And once the narrative exists, it becomes the lens through which the entire relationship gets reinterpreted. This process reveals something essential about behavior analysis. We don't feel something and then understand it. We feel something, then create understanding that justifies what we felt. The dumper isn't lying when they say the relationship wasn't right. They're reporting their current experience as if it were objective truth. But psychological dynamics are more complex than that. What they're actually describing is the relief of ending internal conflict, not necessarily the truth of whether the relationship was salvageable. The story forms retroactively. Moments of difficulty get weighted more heavily. Moments of connection get reframed as exceptions or early-stage illusions. The past is being edited to match the present. There's a particular tone to these narratives. They're not defensive yet. That comes later, when challenged. Right now, they're clarifying. The dumper is explaining it to themselves as much as to anyone else. They'll start sentences with, "I just realized," or, "Looking back now, I can see." As if the clarity was always there, just hidden. But the clarity isn't from looking back. It's from looking at how they feel now and reverse engineering causation. Emotional distance, which was likely present long before the breakup, gets reinterpreted as evidence that the relationship was already over. The narrative becomes, "I left because it was dead." When often, the more accurate version is, "It died because I left, emotionally, long before I physically did." These stories serve a function. They protect against doubt, against regret, against the discomfort of ambiguity. If the dumper can construct a clear, linear narrative where the relationship was wrong and leaving was right, then the relief makes sense. Then they don't have to sit with the possibility that they might be feeling better simply because they're avoiding intimacy, or because they left before doing the harder work of repair. The narrative doesn't have to be malicious to be incomplete. It just has to be convincing enough to keep doubt at bay. And for now, with relief still fresh and consequences still forming in the distance, the story holds. But stories built on feelings rather than patterns have a way of cracking when tested by time. Something shifts in how they respond to the world. Where they used to feel triggered by a text tone, by plans changing, by certain conversational patterns, now there's just nothing, or close to nothing. The emotional reactivity that defined so much of the relationship's final stage has quieted. The dumper notices this and takes it as confirmation. If they're this calm now, then clearly the relationship was the source of instability. Clearly leaving was the right choice. The logic feels airtight. Remove the variable, measure the change. The change is real, so the variable must have been the problem. But relationship dynamics rarely operate with that kind of clean causation. What's actually happening is more layered. The reduction in emotional reactivity isn't only about removing a problematic relationship. It's about removing emotional stakes entirely. When you're no longer invested, you're no longer activated. That's not growth. That's withdrawal. The psychological dynamics of detachment create a kind of artificial stability. It feels like emotional regulation, because nothing is reaching the threshold that would require regulation. There's no one close enough to trigger attachment patterns, no intimacy pressing against old wounds, no vulnerability demanding that they show up differently. The calm they're experiencing is the calm of emotional disengagement, not the calm of emotional maturity. But from the inside, it reads as evidence. The dumper starts to compare how they felt then versus how they feel now. The contrast is stark. Back then, tense, reactive, exhausted. Now, steady, unbothered, clear. The conclusion seems obvious. What they don't see yet is that the reactivity wasn't just about the relationship being wrong. It was about two nervous systems in close proximity, both carrying unhealed patterns, both activating each other's unmet emotional needs and unspoken fears. Yes, there was reactivity. But reactivity in itself doesn't mean incompatibility. Sometimes it means the relationship was touching something real, something unresolved. And rather than face that, the dumper removed themselves from the activation entirely. There's a cost to this kind of calm, but it hasn't become visible yet. When emotional reactivity decreases because you've removed all emotional risk, you've also removed the possibility of emotional growth. You've created safety, but you've also created stagnation. The dumper doesn't feel stagnant. They feel free. But freedom that comes from avoiding challenge isn't freedom. It's just a longer leash. The belief that the decision was necessary grows stronger every day they don't feel what they used to feel. But absence of pain isn't the same as presence of rightness. And the distinction between the two is something they won't be able to see until the initial relief fades and the structural emptiness underneath starts making itself known. Detachment, in the beginning, looks a lot like healing. The dumper isn't thinking about the other person constantly. Reminders of the relationship don't send them spiraling. They can talk about it, if asked, with a kind of measured distance that sounds like maturity. They've processed it. They've moved on. From the outside, and even from the inside, it looks like emotional resolution. But attachment patterns tell a different story. What's often mistaken for closure is actually the successful completion of emotional withdrawal. The feelings didn't resolve. They just finished leaving. This distinction matters because the two states, resolution and detachment, produce similar external presentations but opposite internal architectures. Resolution means you've integrated the experience, learned from it, and can hold both the good and the difficult without defensiveness. Detachment means you've created enough distance that nothing touches you anymore. The dumper in this phase often reports feeling fine or at peace, and they're not lying. But the peace is fragile. It depends on not being challenged, not being confronted with what was lost, not allowing themselves to feel the full weight of the absence. It's peace built on avoidance, not integration. There's a specific behavior that reveals this. The dumper can discuss the relationship, but only in certain ways. They can talk about what went wrong, why it didn't work, what they've learned in the abstract. But if the conversation moves toward what they miss, toward moments of real connection, toward their own role in the breakdown, the tone shifts. Defensiveness appears, or deflection, or a quick intellectual bypass. The emotional withdrawal that allowed them to leave in the first place is still operating. It's not just that they're over it. It's that they're not allowing themselves to fully be in relationship with it, even in retrospect. And that's not resolution. That's continued avoidance wearing the language of growth. The early signs are easy to miss because they're quiet. The dumper mentions the ex in passing without visible pain. That's read as healing. They're dating again, or at least open to it. That's read as moving forward. They're not crying, not obsessing, not scrolling through old photos at 2 a.m. That's read as strength. But emotional behavior isn't always loudest when it's most active. Sometimes the most significant patterns are the ones that operate in silence. The absence of pain doesn't always mean presence of health. Sometimes it just means successful numbing. And numbing, when mistaken for resolution, creates a foundation that can't hold weight when life inevitably asks them to be emotionally available again. There's a grace period, a stretch of time where the dumper exists in a kind of suspension. Relief is present, consequences are not. They're living in the space between action and reaction, between decision and reckoning. The surface calm holds because nothing has arrived yet to disturb it. They're not facing the reality of what was lost, not confronting the possibility that the relief might have been situational rather than indicative of truth. The psychological dynamics of this phase are deceptive. Everything feels stable because the system hasn't been tested. The consequences aren't absent, they're just postponed. This postponement is structural, not accidental. The dumper has created conditions that protect against immediate emotional impact. They've filled their time, maintained routines, kept themselves in motion. Relationship psychology shows a consistent pattern. People don't usually fall apart right after a breakup they initiated. They fall apart later, when the distraction fades, when the initial relief wears thin, when the absence starts to feel less like freedom and more like loss. But in these early weeks or months, that later moment feels distant, almost theoretical. The dumper is too busy experiencing relief to notice the ways they're carefully avoiding deeper reflection. There's something almost architectural about how this works. The mind builds scaffolding, narratives, justifications, new routines that keep the structure upright. But scaffolding isn't foundation, it's temporary support. And beneath it, something else is happening. The emotional consequences of the breakup, the grief, the doubt, the recognition of what was discarded along with what was released, are accumulating silently. They're not gone. They're deferred. The dumper hasn't dealt with them. They've simply created enough buffer that the feelings haven't reached conscious awareness yet. But feelings don't disappear just because they're not felt. They wait. What makes this particularly complex is that the dumper genuinely believes they're through it. The worst is over. They made the hard decision, endured the difficult conversation, survived the initial aftermath. From their vantage point, they're on the other side. But behavior analysis reveals something different. They're not on the other side. They're in the middle, mistaking the eye of the storm for the end of weather. The calm they're experiencing is real, but it's not conclusive. It's the calm that comes before the second wave, the one that arrives not with the shock of the break, but with the slow, accumulating realization of everything that break actually meant. And that wave is already forming, just beyond the edge of their current awareness. The first crack is so small it barely registers. Maybe it's a song, or a scent, or the way light hits a room at a particular hour. Something ordinary that suddenly isn't. The dumper feels something they haven't felt since the breakup. Not longing exactly, not regret, but a kind of hollow recognition. A sense that something is missing that they didn't realize was structural. The relief is still there, but now there's something else alongside it. Not loud, not disruptive, just present. This is the moment the postponed consequences begin their arrival. Not as a crash, but as a slow reveal. The emotional distance that created the relief is starting to show its other face. At first, these signs are easy to dismiss. A moment of sadness doesn't mean the decision was wrong. Feeling lonely doesn't invalidate the reasons for leaving. The dumper has their narrative, and these feelings are just adjustments, growing pains, the normal discomfort of any major life change. They tell themselves this, and it's not entirely wrong. But what they're not seeing yet is the pattern forming. The moments are increasing in frequency. The hollow feeling that was occasional is becoming ambient. Something in the architecture of their emotional life is beginning to shift, not collapsing dramatically, but settling, the way a structure settles when it realizes the foundation isn't as solid as it appeared. This is where relationship patterns that were always present start to become visible. The dumper begins to notice behaviors in themselves they thought they'd left behind. Emotional triggers reappear, not tied to the ex, but surfacing in new contexts. They feel reactive again, but without the clear target that made reactivity make sense before. There's irritability, restlessness, a kind of low-level dissatisfaction that doesn't attach to anything specific. Psychological dynamics that were masked by the relief of leaving are reasserting themselves. Because here's what becomes clear, eventually. The patterns weren't just about that relationship. They were about how this person does intimacy, avoids vulnerability, manages closeness. Leaving didn't resolve those patterns. It just removed the mirror. The collapse, when it comes, isn't what people expect. It's not crying over old photos or desperate late-night texts. It's subtler and more pervasive. It's the realization that the relief was temporary and the emptiness is structural. That the calm they felt was the calm of withdrawal, not resolution. That they're not actually more emotionally regulated. They're just more emotionally alone. And that aloneness, which felt like freedom, is starting to feel like something else. The dumper doesn't usually name this moment when it's happening. They just notice they're tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. That they're going through motions that used to feel like life. That the peace they've been living in has started to feel less like peace and more like the quiet that comes before you realize something essential has been lost. The relief doesn't lie, but it also doesn't tell the whole truth. What the dumper feels in those early days and weeks is real. The lightness, the calm, the sense that a burden has finally been lifted. But relief born from removing complexity isn't the same as peace built on resolution. One is a pause, the other is a foundation. And the difference between them only becomes clear later, when the initial euphoria fades, and what remains is not freedom, but a particular kind of emptiness that no amount of distance can fill. This isn't about right or wrong decisions. It's not about whether leaving was justified or whether staying would have saved anything. It's about understanding that emotional behavior follows patterns, and patterns don't stop just because circumstances change. The dumper who feels relief now is often the same person who will, months down the line, find themselves in a new situation, feeling the same old tension. Not because they chose wrong again, but because they never addressed what was underneath. Relationship dynamics don't resolve through subtraction. They require examination. And examination requires staying still long enough to feel what you've been running from. The collapse, when it comes, doesn't announce itself. It emerges slowly, in moments of unexpected hollowness, in the realization that the calm you've been living in depends entirely on keeping everyone at a safe distance. The dumper eventually discovers that the relief was circumstantial, not structural. That they didn't heal. They just stopped being challenged. And challenge, uncomfortable as it is often where real growth lives. What looked like strength was sometimes just successful avoidance. What felt like clarity was sometimes just the comfort of not having to face your own patterns reflected back at you. Understanding this doesn't undo the decision. It doesn't make the relationship salvageable in hindsight. But it does something more important. It reveals where the real work lives. Not in analyzing whether you left the right person, but in understanding why relief and collapse can coexist in the same nervous system. Why emotional withdrawal feels like peace until it doesn't. Why the patterns you thought you left behind have a way of reassembling themselves in new contexts, with new people, wearing slightly different faces but operating from the same core wound. If this resonated, if you recognized something in these patterns that you haven't been able to name, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Because understanding relationship psychology isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about seeing clearly what's actually happening beneath the surface, in yourself, and in the spaces between people. That's where the real answers live. But here's what most people miss, and what the dumper almost never sees coming. Before the relief, before the decision, before the conversation that ended everything, there was a shift. Small, silent, easy to dismiss as nothing. A moment where emotional behavior changed in a way that set all of this in motion, and neither person caught it in time. That shift is where everything actually begins. Not at the breakup, not when the words were finally said. Earlier, quieter, more dangerous because it felt like nothing at all. If you want to understand how relationships unravel before anyone admits they're unraveling, you need to watch the previous video. The first emotional shift you didn't notice in time. It breaks down the exact moment the psychological dynamics changed, the precise behavior that signaled detachment was beginning, and why both people missed it even though it was happening right in front of them. This isn't optional context. It's the foundation. You can't fully understand the relief without understanding what created the conditions for relief to feel necessary in the first place. Go watch it now, then come back to this one. Because once you see that first shift, everything else, the distance, the silence, the relief, the collapse, makes a different kind of sense. The kind of sense that changes how you see every relationship pattern you've ever been part of.